Section 10, page 36, Chapter 7. Miss Henry van der Luyden listened in silence to her cousin Mrs. Archer's narrative. It was all very well to tell yourself in advance that Miss van der Luyden was always silent, and that, thought non-committal by nature and training, she was very kind to the people she really liked. Even personal experience of these facts was not always a protection from the chill that descended on one of the high-ceilinged, white-walled Madison Avenue drawing room. With the pale brocaded armchairs so obviously uncovered for the occasion, and the gauze still veiling the ornamental ornaments, and the beautiful old carved frame of Gainsborough's Lady Angelica Dulac, Mrs. van der Luyden's portrait by Huntington, in parentheses, in black velvet and vanishing point, faced that of her lovely ancestress. It was generally considered as fine as a cabinet, and though 20 years had elapsed since its execution, was still a perfect likeness. Indeed, the Mrs. van der Luyden, who sat beneath it listening to Mrs. Archer, might have been the twin sister of the fair and still youngish woman, drooping against a gilt armchair before a green wrap curtain. Mrs. van der Luyden still wore black velvet and vanishing point when she went into society, or rather, in parentheses, since she never dined out, when she threw open her own doors to receive it. Her fair hair, which had faded without turning grey, was still parted in flat overlapping points on her forehead, and the straight nose that divided her pale blue eyes was only a little more pinched about the nostrils than when the portrait had been painted. She always, indeed, struck Newland Archer as having been rather gruesomely preserved in the airless atmosphere of a perfectly irreproachable existence, as bodies caught in glaciers keep for years a rosy life in death. Like all his family, he esteemed and admired Mrs. van der Luyden, but he found her gentle bending sweetness less approachable than the grimness of some of his mother's old aunts, fire spinsters who said no on principle before they knew what they were going to be asked. Mrs. van der Luyden's attitude said neither yes nor no, but always appeared to incline to clemency, till her thin lips, wavering into the shadow of a smile, made the almost invariable reply, "I shall first have to talk this over with my husband." She and Mr. van der Luyden were so exactly alike that Archer often wondered how, after 40 years of the closest conjugality, two such merged identities ever separated themselves enough for anything as controversial as a talking over. But as neither had ever reached a decision without prefacing it by this mysterious conclave, Mrs. Archer and her son, having set forth their case, waited resignedly for the familiar phrase. Mrs. van der Luyden, however, who had seldom surprised anyone, now surprised them by reaching her long hand toward the bell rope. "I think," she said, "I should like Henry to hear what you have told me." A footman appeared, to whom she gravely added, "If Mr. van der Luyden has finished reading the newspaper, please ask him to be kind enough to come." She said reading the newspaper, in the tone in which a minister's wife might have said, presiding a cabinet meeting, not from any arrogance of mind, but because of the habit of a lifetime, and the attitude of her friends and relations had led her to consider Mr. van der Luyden's least gesture as having an almost sacerdotal importance. Her promptness of action showed that she considered the case as pressing as Mrs. Archer, but lest she should be thought to have committed herself in advance, she added, with the sweetest look, "Henry always enjoys seeing you, dear Adeline, and he will wish to congratulate Newland." The double doors had solemnly reopened, and between them appeared Mr. Henry van der Luyden, tall, spare and frock-coated, with faded fair hair, a straight nose like his wife's, and the same look of frozen gentleness in eyes that were merely pale grey instead of pale blue. Mr. van der Luyden greeted Mrs. Archer with cousinly affability, preferred to Newland low-voiced congratulations, couched in the same language as his wife's, and seated himself in one of the brocade armchairs, with the simplicity of a reigning sovereign. "I had just finished reading the Times," he said, laying his long fingertips together. "In town my mornings are so much occupied that I find it more convenient to read the newspaper after luncheon. Ah, there is a great deal to be said for that plan. Indeed, I think my Uncle Egmont used to say he found it less aggravating not to read the morning papers till after dinner," said Mrs. Archer responsively. "Yes, my good father abhorred hurry, but now we live in a constant rush," said Mr. van der Luyden in a measured tones, looking with pleasant deliberation about the large shrouded room, which to Archer was so complete an image of its owners. "But I hope you had finished your reading, Henry," his wife interposed. Quite, he reassured her. "Then I should like Adeline to tell you." "Oh, it's really Newland's story," said his mother, smiling, and proceeded to rehearse once more the monstrous tale of the affront inflicted on Mrs. Lovell Mingott. "Of course," she ended, "Augusta Welland and Mary Mingott both felt that, especially in view of Newland's engagement. You and Henry ought to know." "Ah," said Mr. van der Luyden, drawing a deep breath. There was a silence during which the tick of the monumental ormolu clock on the white marble mantelpiece grew as loud as the boom of a minute groan. Archer contemplated with the awe the two slender faded figures, seated side by side in a kind of visceral rigidity, mouthpieces of some remote ancestral authority, which fate compelled them to wield, when they would so much rather have lived simplicity and seclusion, digging invisible weeds out of the perfect lawns of Skyttercliff, and playing patience together in the evenings. Mr. van der Luyden was the first to speak. "You really think this is due to some intentional interference of Lawrence Lefferts?" he inquired, turning to Archer. "I am certain of it, sir. Larry has been going it rather harder than usual lately. If Cousin Lisa won't mind my mentioning it, having rather a stiff affair with the postmaster's wife in their village, or some one of that sort. And whenever poor Gertrude Lefferts begins to suspect anything, and he's afraid of trouble, he gets up a fuss of this kind, to show how awfully moral he is, and talks at the top of his voice about the impertinence of inviting his wife to meet people he doesn't wish her to know. He's simply using Madame Olenska as a lightning rod. I have seen him try the same thing often before." "The Leffertses," said Mr. van der Luyden. "The Leffertses," echoed Mrs. Archer. What would Uncle Egmont have said of Lawrence Lefferts pronouncing on anybody's social position? It shows what society has come to. "We will hope it has not quite come to that," said Mr. van der Luyden firmly. "Ah, if you only use and Louisa went out more," sighed Mr. Archer, but instantly she became aware of her mistake. The van der Luydens were morbidly sensitive to any criticism of their secluded existence. They were arbiters of fashion, the court of last appeal, and they knew it, and bowed to their fate. But being shy and retiring persons, with no natural inclination for their part, they lived as much as possible in the Sylvan solitude of Skyttercliff, and when they came to town, declined all invitations on the plea of Mrs. van der Luyden's health. Newland Archer came to his mother's rescue. "Everybody in New York knows what you and Cousin Lisa represent. That's why Mrs. Mingott felt she ought not to allow this slight on Countess Olenska to pass without consulting you." Mrs. van der Luyden glanced at her husband, who glanced back at her. "It is a principle that I dislike," said Mr. van der Luden. "As long as a member of a well-known family is backed up by that family, it should be considered final." "It seems to me," said his wife, as if she were producing a new thought. "I had no idea," Mr. van der Luden continued, "that things had come to such a pass." He paused and looked at his wife again. "It occurs to me, my dear, that the Countess Oleska is already a sort of relation through Medora Manson's first husband. At any rate, she will be when Newland marries." He turned toward the young man. "Have you read this morning's Times, Newland?" "Why, yes, sir," said Archer, who usually tossed off half a dozen papers with his morning coffee. Husband and wife looked at each other again. Their pale eyes clung together in a prolonged and serious consultation. Then a faint smile fluttered over Mrs. van der Luden's face. She had evidently guessed and approved. Mr. van der Luden turned to Mrs. Archer. "If Liza's health allowed her to dine out, I wish you would say to Mrs. Lovell Mingott. She and I would have been happy to fill the places of the Lawrence Leftlers at her dinner." He paused to let the irony of this sink in. "As you know, this is impossible." Mrs. Archer sounded a sympathetic assent. "But Newland tells me he has read this morning's Times. Therefore, he has probably seen that Liza's relative, the Duke of St. Austray, arrives next week on the Russia. He is coming to enter his new sloop, the Genevieve, in the next summer's international cup race, and also to have a little canvasback shooting at Trevenna." Mr. van der Luden paused again, and continued with increasing benevolence. "Before taking him down to Maryland, we are inviting a few friends to meet him here, only a little dinner, with a reception afterward. I am sure Lisa will be as glad as I am, if Countess Olenska will let us include her among our guests." He got up, bent his long body with a stiff friendliness toward his cousin, and added, "I think I have Liza's authority for saying that. She will herself leave the invitation to dine when she drives out presently. With our cards, of course, with our cards." Mrs. Archer, who knew this to be a hint that the 17-hand chestnuts, which were never kept waiting, were at the door, rose with a hurried murmur of thanks. Mrs. van der Luden beamed on her with a smile of Esther interceding with Ahasuerus, but her husband raised a protesting hand. "There is nothing to thank me for, dear Adeline, nothing whatever. This kind of thing must not happen in New York. It shall not. As long as I can help it," he pronounced with sovereign gentleness as he steered his cousins to the door. 2 hours later, everyone knew that the great Sea Spring brochure, in which Mrs. van der Luden took the air at all seasons, had been seen at old Mrs. Mingott's door, where a large square envelope was handed in, and that evening at the opera Mr. Sillerton Jackson was able to state that the envelope contained a card inviting the Countess Olenska to the dinner, which the van der Ludens were giving the following week for their cousin, the Duke of the St. Austray. Some of the younger men in the club box exchanged a smile at this announcement, and glanced sideways at Lawrence Lefferts, who sat carelessly in front of the box, pulling his long fair mustache, and who remarked with authority, as the soprano paused, "No one but Patty ought to attempt the sonnambula." Chapter 8. It was generally agreed in New York that the Countess Olenska had lost her looks. She had appeared there first, in Newland Archer's boyhood, as a brilliant, pretty little girl of 9 or 10, of whom people said that she ought to be painted. Her parents had been continental wanderers, and after a roaming babyhood she had lost them both, and been taken in charge by her aunt, Medora Manson, also a wanderer, who was herself returning to New York to settle down. Poor Medora, repeatedly widowed, was always coming home to settle down, in parentheses, each time in a less expensive house, and bringing with her a new husband or an adopted child. But after a few months she invariably parted from her husband or quarreled with her ward, and, having got rid of her house at a loss, set out again on her wanderings. As her mother had been a Rushworth, and her last unhappy marriage had linked her to one of the crazy Chiverses, New York looked indulgently on her eccentricities, but when she returned with her little orphaned niece, whose parents had been popular in spite of their regrettable taste for travel, people thought it a pity that the pretty child should be in such hands. Everyone was disposed to be kind to little Ellen Mingott, though her dusky red cheeks and tight curls gave her an air of gaiety that seemed unsuitable in a child who should still have been in black for her parents. It was one of the misguided Medora's many peculiarities to flout the unalterable rules that regulated American mourning, and when she stepped from the steamer, her family were scandalized to see that the crepe veil she wore for her own brother was 7 inches shorter than those of her sisters-in-law, while little Ellen was in crimson merino and amber beads, like a gypsy foundling. But New York had so long resigned itself to Medora that only a few old ladies shook their heads over Ellen's gaudy clothes, while her other relations fell under the charm of her high color and high spirits. She was a fearless and familiar little thing, who asked discourteous questions, made precocious comments, and possessed outlandish arts, such as dancing a Spanish shawl dance and singing Napoleon love songs to a guitar, under the direction of her aunt, in parentheses, whose real name was Mrs. Thorley Shivers, but who, having received a papal title, had resumed her first husband's patronymic and called herself the Marchioness Manson, because in Italy she could turn it into Manzoni. The little girl received an expensive but incoherent education, which included drawing from the model, a thing never dreamed of before, and playing the piano in quintets with professional musicians. Of course, no good could come of this, and when, a few years later, poor Shiver's family died in a madhouse, his widow, in parentheses, draped in strange weeds, again pulled up stakes and departed with Ellen, who had grown into a tall, bony girl with conspicuous eyes. For some time no more was heard of them. Then news came of Ellen's marriage to an immensely rich Polish nobleman of legendary fame, whom she had met at a ball at the Tuileries, and who was said to have princely establishments in Paris, Nice, and Florence, a yacht at Covest, and many square miles of shooting in Transylvania. She disappeared in a kind of sulphurous apotheosis, and when a few years later Medora again came back to New York, subdued, impoverished, mourning a third husband, and in quest of a still smaller house, people wondered that her rich niece hadn't been able to do something for her. Then came the news that Ellen's own marriage had ended in disaster, and that she was herself returning home to seek oblivion among her kinsfolk. These things passed through Newland Archer's mind a week later, as he watched the Countess Olenska enter the van der Luyden drawing room on the evening of a momentous dinner. The occasion was a solemn one, and he wondered a little nervously how she should carry off it. She came rather late, one hand still ungloved, and fastening a bracelet about her wrist, yet she entered without any appearance of haste or embarrassment the drawing room in which New York's most chosen company was somehow awfully assembled. End of the section, page 43.